I'm Dan Grabois, and this is the $2 Broom podcast. Today I'm talking with John Yin, and John is a professor here at UW-Madison in the College of Engineering. John, hello.
Hello, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so glad you could talk to me about the origins of life and other things, but you're a professor of engineering, so what does that have to do with the origins of life?
Oh boy, good question. I guess that takes me back to why I got interested in maybe biology. So you have a few minutes. Um, Grad studies, I was tasked with the project to remove heavy metals from wastewater. Heavy metals are bad because they're toxic to biological systems. And we do have metals in us that are beneficial. So the toxic metals tend to displace the beneficial metals, and they are bad for us. Turns out that biology has found ways to bind those sorts of metals with certain kinds of proteins. And my thesis project was actually to try to use such proteins to remove metals. And I ultimately developed a project that was in some ways successful in grabbing onto toxic metals, stealing ideas from nature, not precisely copying and not using nature's molecules, but copying what we understood of nature's molecules. And I said, okay, nature figured out a solution to this problem. How did nature ever do that? And you ask anyone who studies biology, and they say, well, nature does a trial and error process called evolution. Some things are beneficial, some mutations or changes are not beneficial. And those beneficial mutations are ones that are propagated over many generations. So I got interested in evolution, even though an engineer and I'm trying to find solutions to societal problems. It seems like nature's pretty robust in its ability to find solutions. And that sent me off to Germany for postdoctoral work where I wanted to learn more about evolution. And I wanted to try to do evolution in the lab, and this ended up doing working with viruses, which are the masters of evolution. And at the same time, the lab there was developing theories coming from a physics and chemistry perspective on how matter can evolve. And so that addresses directly questions of origins of life. And I got interested in those sorts of questions from there.
So I and probably a lot of people like me who are definitely not scientists and in a completely different realm in our lives, I think we probably most of us have the idea of a scientist being a person who does, say, biology and studies a particular gland in a particular bird that does a particular thing, and that's what science is. You have a much more global approach to what you do, and is this tolerated within the sciences?
I would say barely. So I had the deficiency going into college of thinking, I really liked high school where I took the biology and chemistry and physics. I'm going to just continue doing that. And when I got to college, people told me, well, there's this concept of a major. Please embrace it. And the majors were, chemistry or biology or physics. And I said, well, what if I want to do all of these things? So, I looked at biochemistry or biophysics, and it turned out my roommate was a chemical engineer. And I looked at some of his textbooks and I said, this is neat. There's some physics in here, there's some chemistry. I bet there could be some biology. And I ended up moving from my liberal arts major, which was focused on some biology, chemistry, or physics, to a combined major that essentially allowed me to pursue these broader sciences while ultimately ending up with a chemical engineering degree. So it was a 5-year program, 2 bachelor's degrees, one in liberal arts and one in chemical engineering, and taking an extra year, but also taking a bunch of other broader courses and really trying to avoid majoring. So that's sort of a story that, I love all of these sciences and approaches, and I guess to some extent I haven't grown up yet. And so I somehow fell into chemical engineering because it allowed me to take the diversity of sorts of courses I was interested in taking.
Well, I hope along those terms you never do grow up. So the University of Wisconsin here in Madison actually has the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, which is not afraid of these kinds of combinations of fields. So you really found a home that could probably nurture these kinds of investigations that you like to do.
That is the idea, and I think we have a director at the Institute, Joe Handelsman, who was a faculty member at Wisconsin, then was hired away by Yale. She's a microbiologist, and then she was hired away by the White House under Obama to serve as a scientific advisor. And when she finished that gig, we had a opportunity to invite her back, and we managed to lure her back to campus. So she's done a wonderful job at the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, really challenging us to think about what does it mean to do interdisciplinary research. And I think I've been challenged by that too, because I'm sitting next to people from computer science, from math, from psychology and we're grappling with, well, what do we have in common? And she has challenged us to do that, and we had the interesting discussions of robustness, resilience, and adaptability as features that natural systems have, as well as engineered systems. You'd like them to be robust, and that's kind of an interesting way of grasping how we as scientists, engineers, could be medical doctors, are thinking about the big challenges of either engineered or natural systems.
And I think a little later we probably will get into that question of natural systems versus engineered human-made ones. But for now, let's get into the origins of life with a very simple question, I'm sure, which is what is life?
Yeah, what is life? Okay, thanks a lot for that one. So I don't really have a compact definition, but I lean on one that came out of a study from NASA. This is back in 1990s, where they got together, experts, world experts on exobiology, which you might know is this field of you could call it either astronomy or biology that thinks about the possibility of life beyond the planet Earth. So they were tasked with coming up with some kind of definition, and their definition was essentially that life is a self-sustained chemical system capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution. All right. So if self-sustained, meaning it's a chemical system. So you think about reactions, various molecules that are being transformed into other molecules, and it's self-sustaining. It keeps on going. It's always you had your breakfast, you're going to have your dinner. All of that stuff in you are these reactions transforming what you have in intake into waste and energy and your ability to perceive what's going on. So that aspect of undergoing Darwinian evolution then means that as you have essentially a program in each of your cells that your parents gave to you, and that program, as it propagates to your ch children and grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, will gradually change. And that's the whole aspect of the evolutionary process. So it tries to grapple with chemical transformation and the possibility that there's some kind of information informing that kind of transformation. And ultimately that information can change, can be transformed into something that might enable little microbes in the early Earth to eventually become something like a human. So complex processes.
Oh, okay. I see. So a volcano spews out lava and fire and changes its environment, but there's nothing self-sustaining there. There's nothing reproducible. That's a one-time event. So in life, we're dealing with non-one-time events, but there's some sort of propagation together with transformation.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's go, and when we're talking about the origins of life, we're talking about the very early Earth. I want to get into the kinds of experiments that you do, but can we first talk about the early Earth? I'm looking out my window. It's, as you know, a glorious day today.
Yeah.
I see a tree that's in flower and grass and plants and, of course, houses and the road, but this is not the picture of the sort of primitive Earth at all. So when we think about life coming to be, can you paint a picture of what Earth was like then?
Well, I wasn't there, and I don't think anyone was, but I think we do have some idea that there was no oxygen present. So if we were around at that time, we wouldn't have had any food, or we wouldn't have been able to survive those kinds of harsh environments. So in the early planet, then no life on it, a lifeless planet, maybe with much more of the sorts of activities as you were alluding to with the volcano. So the Earth is really trying to settle down from this entity that maybe was spewing off in the early stages of the galaxy. Now you're really probing into areas that I have very little expertise, other than it was a lifeless planet, and it wouldn't have been habitable for any kind of life that we know of today. Higher temperatures, no oxygen, just not a very what you would consider a pleasant place to spend some time. So yeah, I'm not sure what else I can really say about that. And but somehow there were chemicals present, and these could start to do transformations and perhaps give rise to interesting molecules that, the people who think about origins of life then are tending to look at living systems and trying to imagine how simple components could start to build up to more complex ones.
Okay, so that's where we need to go, and we need to go there for people like me who don't know their science very well. I'm guessing there's not a line in the sand where on this side of it, there's no life, and then all of a sudden there are creatures.
Yeah,
So are there some sort of molecules that could be said maybe to be alive and maybe not to be alive? I know viruses, there's some debate about whether they are actually alive.
yeah.
Did life start with viruses, or how do we go from a planet that's probably geologically quite active, but in terms of biology, completely nothing?
Yeah.
What's
So
our first step?
yeah, maybe we lean on that definition from NASA. Self-sustaining chemistry is one aspect of it. So chemistry that could just keep on going. And the other part is the Darwinian selection alludes to some kind of information. And we know today there's something called DNA or RNA, and these are chain molecules that have different characters in them that encode information in a manner analogous to the way words encode information for us. So there is an aspect of information. Information could also be particular kinds of chemical reactions that happen to occur and perhaps change over time. A more abstract way of thinking about information, but to have reactions that are able to sustain themselves. So generally, living systems are things that are taking in energy. You had to have your breakfast, going to have your lunch. You're extracting energy from these sorts of systems. So from the food that you eat. And it's essentially taking, you could say, energy-rich molecules and breaking them down to extract energy for what to help sustain that system. So some people approach the chemistry to say, all right, well, where can we find examples of that in us? And in us, it is just those sorts of reactions where, well, when you have your breakfast, what happens? And so science of the last 150 years has focused on what happens during metabolism. How do we break down the food? So there are very clear, well-defined reactions, fundamentals of biochemistry of what happens, for example, to a sugar molecule when it enters your metabolism and you start to break it down and extract energy from it. And people look for those kinds of molecules and look at the kinds of chemistries that are involved and try to say, well, how could these kinds of chemistries arise? Um, they also look at information molecules, like the genome that your parents gave to you, a mixture of your mother's and your father's DNA, and they think about, well, how could information molecules come about? So information molecules, in the very simplest way of thinking about them, are linear strings. So they tend to be built up of, you think about a train with the various cars of the train linked together. And if those cars are replaced by molecular units, how one chains together those cars is analogous to the sorts of chemistries that allow you to link together the molecules into a chain that can then have store information. So some cars might be black and some might be white, and or ones and zeros. You can think of these as being chained together. So there's a way that one can imagine molecular information arising. And these are at least two different kinds of ways of thinking about extracting energy from chemistries and starting to store information using chemistries.
Is it, I get all that, and that's great. I'm understanding. I think our audience is understanding. So, um, what is a frustration in the conversation is that we take refuge in biology and looking at ourselves and making these analogies. But as you go backwards in time, suddenly you don't have that. And you have this transformative moment. I imagine this is the joy and elation and incredible frustration of your field is that there wasn't that stuff happening. And then there was that stuff happening. I remember watching a Nova probably in the 1970s when I was a kid, and it showed, a model of primitive Earth, and there's water and there's lightning, and boom, now we have life. And that is comforting, but maybe false. I mean, I can't imagine that a molecule was formed which was, by our definition, living, and then it made more, and we're off and running, and the end result is us. So, can you give a possible scenario of something happening in that on that proto Earth that would lead maybe to something else and then to something else, maybe three steps that would take us from that time that we totally don't get towards where we are now?
Yeah, yeah. So I guess two scenarios come to mind. And both of them were one of them. They're both experiments that have kind of formed a little bit of how people think about chemical origins of life. So the first experiment was done in 1953 at University of Chicago. This is one that if you crack open a high school biology textbook, you will find some description of it. This was carried out by Stanley Miller, a graduate student who was working with Urey, a famous chemist, physical chemist, and they were interested in origins of life. And they thought about that early Earth lifeless planet and tried to wonder, well, how could we have started to form some of the kinds of molecules that we see in living systems from a very early environment where there were maybe simple gases around. So they looked at the what was known about the early atmosphere, no oxygen, but probably the presence of methane, probably the presence of ammonia, uh, probably some hydrogen, water, certainly. So they essentially created this primitive atmosphere. And they, maybe inspired a little bit by Mary Shelley, said, let's give some energy to this system. And they sparked it. So they set up an ability to offer energy to this system through a spark. And they also had some water present. You can think of this as a primitive ocean. And after providing the energy to this primitive environment, just gases there, they opened up and sampled the water and analyzed it. And using the best tools of analytical chemistry of the early 1950s, they found, lo and behold, amino acids. So amino acids are more complex than methane, than water. These are building together. Amino acids we know today are the building blocks of the proteins that run many of the reactions that we survive on. So this is a major step in saying how can something, a building block to living systems, arise from simple components, relatively simple gases, provided energy. Now you find these amino acids. And now when there are meteoroids that have been delivered to our planet, you look at those, you find amino acids and other sorts of organic molecules, and you say, "Wow, that's pretty neat. This is probably happening not just on our planet, but elsewhere in the universe, or elsewhere in the galaxy." And at least there's a plausibility of, let's say, a complexity. One of those boxcars arise, a chemical boxcar arising, and different ones arising that we find also in life. And you go, well, that's at least a step. And so, one of the things that we've been interested in is how can these molecules now be stitched together to start forming chains? But the key experiment there was to see that simple atmosphere, before there was any life or anything that we would recognize as standard building blocks of living systems, just a bit of energy, and you could get the reactions that would form these building blocks. So that was one of the scenarios, and that's in virtually every high school textbook where you get the origins of life. But then they move on to the next topic and they don't tell you how these chain molecules, right? That's kind of a serious gap in our understanding.
Yep, and I've
Um,
asked you for two more steps, which is probably unfair, and you can
yes.
feel free to surmise or propose scenarios.
Yeah, so the maybe getting at one or two of the other steps is that we have long known. Now, if I skip ahead into biology, we know there's in biology there's a molecule known as RNA, so ribonucleic acid. And just a little bit of the basic biology is the parents gave you the DNA that forms a genome that's in each of your cells. And but different cells in your body access that information in different ways. So cells in your brain need to have particular proteins that are important for the development of your brain and the functioning of your brain. Then they're going to go into the DNA that essentially says, here's what's important for the brain. The DNA is the full information, and your brain only needs to access part of it. Meanwhile, your heart has to access other parts of it. And so essentially, deciding what part of the total DNA to access gives rise to the different sorts of functions in our different tissues, brain tissue, heart, lungs. These are various different tissues that are making different components access from the DNA. And that the translation of that DNA into some molecule, essentially your brain cells said we need to access this DNA that's ready for the brain. We're going to take that DNA and use it to make RNA, which is like DNA, but this is RNA specific to brain function. And that RNA is going to be used as a template to make proteins, which are going to string together those amino acids that will carry out various sorts of functions.
So that's
So
why these amino acids are important. They turn out to be
yeah,
parts of
yeah.
the needs of life.
Yeah, so basically the RNA was known since the uh, late 1950s, early 1960s as being intermediate between the genome that your parents gave you and the sorts of functions you need to run the machinery of your brain or your muscles or anything else. And we know of RNA more recently during the COVID that, they're so-called RNA vaccines that essentially take RNA that encodes something that looks like the surface of the virus and sends it into you, and then your cells make something that looks like the surface of the virus, but fortunately is not the virus. But it trains your immune system to say, that's something that's foreign. We want to try to be prepared to fight that. And essentially, the RNA that is used, we steal the information of what a virus looks like through its RNA, and we express that in our own cells so our cells can learn how to fight that virus. Well, it's been long known that RNA has been playing this intermediate role that it can encode then various proteins that carry out various functions. But it was in the late 1970s, early 80s that people found that it had another role, that RNA was not just something that you use to make proteins, but that RNA itself could fold up into sorts of structures that could carry out transformations. So it could do the chemistry that we had already originally associated with proteins, which are normally downstream of the RNA. So people said, "Hey, this is neat. RNA is an information molecule. It's made up of four characters, just like DNA, slightly different in the chemistry, but it's also able to fold up in a way that DNA is not able to do. It's able to fold up in a way that proteins do, and then it's able also to carry out reactions in a way that proteins also do." So the proteins, I should say, are what one might associate with that kind of aspect of self-sustaining reactions. We can think of this as maybe the proteins are really facilitating the metabolism. So here was RNA that was originally thought of as kind of just an information molecule that carries information from DNA to proteins. And now it was also playing the role of doing chemistries the way the proteins were doing. We weren't normally thinking of the proteins as being information molecules. So, in the bigger scope of the origins of life, people were looking at, hey, RNA is pretty remarkable in the sense that if you can build these RNA boxcars and string them together, then you could be storing information the way DNA does, but you could also, these things could fold up and start to carry out transformations the way proteins do. So it was from that period that this idea of an RNA world emerged, and people thought, well, maybe RNA was, really the first key molecule that if you could store information and also carry out transformations, then it's doing maybe the two tasks that this NASA group, suggested was important for origins of life. The challenge on that is that it's much harder to get those RNA building blocks. You can't just do that sort of experiment that Stanley Miller did and get these kinds of building blocks of RNA from putting in energy to form the amino acids. It's much easier to make the amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, spontaneously or through relatively simple chemistries than it is to build the building blocks of RNA or even DNA. But there has been advances by the leading organic chemists who think about the potential chemistries that could occur, and they are able to create RNA molecules after much work. And this is still cutting edge research on how these building blocks could come about. They are figuring out plausible steps to the building blocks of RNA, and that's kind of a frontier area of the origins of life chemistry. But there is a lot of debate. What were the key early molecules? Were they more metabolic? Were they more information processing? Was it RNA? Was it building blocks like amino acids? So all of that's pretty much up in the air.
Okay, I'm trying to grapple with all of this,
Yeah,
and
too much. I should
I
give you a chance to interrupt because I may have lost you in the
no,
early.
that's okay. I kind of get it, but I have this image of two little magnets, and they're not interacting, and I bring them together slowly, and then all of a sudden they feel each other's magnetic field and they slam together.
Okay.
And that's what this RNA is feeling like to me. Like all of a sudden, now we have these molecules interacting and forming very complicated molecules. I'm guessing that we've compressed 1 billion years into a moment here. I mean, or in fact, is the chemistry such that It's all ready to go with simple structures that can just glom onto each other, and suddenly we have complexity. That's number one. And number two is complexity a requirement for something to be considered alive?
Yeah, good questions and both tough ones. So the magnet aspect of it, I think arose because I gave you the RNA and I said, well, people made this discovery that the RNA could act like a protein, and that was I guess a pivotal moment for how people think about RNA. That it's not just some information molecule, but it's also able to do all these chemistries that people didn't imagine it could do. So in that sense, it was like the magnets slamming together and people saying, ah, hey, this could be an RNA world. But it still dodges the question of, well, how do we build these building blocks of RNA and how do they get strung together and then start to do these things in a world where they didn't before? So the emergent properties I dodged altogether. This was just this discovery of people saying, okay, we know this idea of DNA serves as a template to make RNA, which serves as a template to make proteins, and all of that good stuff runs the biology in our cells. And it was just the discovery that, hey, RNA can do these other things that people have gradually appreciated more and more, that it's just not one function as one was originally thought, but many functions. So that aspect, it's true. I would say that things probably didn't just slam together, that there were probably many millions or hundreds of millions of years where little inklings of the possibility of slamming together were building up. And that is the aspect of I think emergent processes that we and many others are interested in. So one kind of emergent process is the ability to reproduce. So a molecule, you take a molecule and it reacts with something else, and it makes we can call this A, B, and C, right? A and B come together, and let's say they stick together. A and B are two building blocks that stick together. So it forms from the building blocks. You have something twice the size, and C is the same as A stuck to B, and stuck to B means there's some kind of a bond between them. So that was one of the interesting questions that people started to ask after seeing that amino acids could be formed from simple building blocks. And there's a quote from Darwin who imagines this little pond where there were building blocks, no amino acids, and maybe amino acids could come together and maybe eventually get uh, the building blocks could form proteins. But it turns out that if you look at the sorts of bond forming between A and B, if A and B are amino acids now, then the bond forming tends to be disfavored in a water environment. So it's not likely if you have two amino acids in water that they're going to come together and form and form the bridge, the bond between them. Instead, it turns out that if you remove water in a drier environment, if A and B are somehow correctly oriented, then the removal of water is something that can promote the coming together of these entities. So that's one area we and others have pursued. If you take these building blocks of life and you dry them down in the dry solid, chemistries can start to happen. We don't normally think of life as being associated with dry solids or strange levels of very basic or acidic conditions. So manipulating the pH or acidity of the environment, we're sort of at a neutral level where it's not too acidic, which would be your vinegar would be an acidic kind of environment. Our blood is not like vinegar. So we and others have manipulated these kinds of dry environments to start showing that, yeah, these chain molecules can start to come together. And that's one tiny step of, building up. Well, the proteins are chain molecules, RNA is a chain molecule, DNA is a chain molecule. Here's how chain molecules can start to form from the building blocks. And the build, I guess I was moving towards self-reproduction. We don't know systems where I give you molecule A and you give it a bunch of building blocks and suddenly there are 100 molecules of A. But that would be one idea. We know of viruses. If I give you one virus particle and I give you a living cell and I allow the virus to exploit the materials of that living cell, then you can get 100 virus particles coming out of that. But that's a complex living system and it's exploiting the complex, rich resources of a living cell. So
Let me jump in here for a second.
yeah,
Um, I am trying to take refuge in really simple models. So I'm imagining Lego blocks now, and Lego blocks were wisely designed to all fit together with each other. If they didn't, it would be a very frustrating toy for a kid. So construction favors Lego blocks over amorphous blobs. Also, we build, like if you imagine having very little in the way of tools, you want to build a house out of stones, you would find the most uniform stones you possibly could. So, is it fair to say that life is likelier to arise if there are molecules which are joinable to other molecules? And have I just described what a protein is, or an amino acid, or something like that?
yeah, you've described a feature that is the modularity, let's say, right? That you want to have, or there's some kind of bias towards things that can be constructed in a similar way. So let's say the joining chemistries. It turns out that even though the boxcars have very different characters chemically that allow them, when they're in a string, to fold back and interact with each other, the actual joining between the boxcars is the same chemistry. So
Right.
you think of the boxcar as having wild chemistries and abilities to interact with other boxcars if we allow the train to fold back on itself. But the joiners between the boxcars are the same chemistry. And the box cars, if they're different, if it's a DNA building blocks, then it's a particular kind of joining for DNA. If it's RNA, it's a particular kind of joining for RNA. That actually is similar, is the same for DNA. It's just the RNA, the boxcar itself is somewhat different. And then for the proteins, it's a different kind of joining. But each of the joining between the boxcars is the same. So
Okay, so we have a to again simplify way easier than what you're talking about.
yeah.
I have a box car that's red and I have a box car that's blue, and it turns out they can link and then fold together. Now it seems like I would have a huge advantage in terms of complexity because I can combine different amounts of that red and that blue. So from two very simple objects, I can get a whole range of purples. So it's not like this thing plus this thing is two. It's now practically an infinity of complexity.
Yeah.
Is this what leads to what we might call life?
I think there's some aspect of that, yes. And indeed, I maybe shouldn't have the folding aspect is a feature that proteins do and RNA do, but there are simple features of the folding that one can extract. So rather than saying, "Hey, this train is so long that it can fold back on itself and those boxcars can interact," I can give you two chain lengths, and I can say I'm not going to allow them to fold, but I will allow them to interact. So I'm taking a step back from the complexity, and I'm gonna I would make the case that just allowing them to interact can maybe introduce some principles that could be useful for thinking about the scaffolding that could lead to greater complexity. So let me, I tend to think in black and white rather than the colors. So I'll talk about black and white box cars. And let's imagine that I have a, um, let's say that if I have a string of all black box cars and I have a string of all white ones, they like to stick together like your magnets. Or I could have alternating black, white, black, and alternating white, black. Did I say black? Yeah,
Yeah,
black, white, black,
black, white.
white, black, and those would also be have the possibility to stick together. You
Although
could,
maybe they would maybe go like that and then stick together. So black to black or black to white, or maybe black
yeah.
to white.
I'm trying to create a rules of interaction.
Okay.
So let's use the opposites attract.
Hmm.
And the attraction is between the strings. So strings, we're not talking about attraction to my next door neighbor on the string. So we allow the possibility that black and white building blocks are available in the soup. And if I allow them to randomly come together, let's suppose we have some kind of directionality from reading from left to right. So we can call white, black, black could be one random product. Another random product could be black, black, white, or black, 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 white, white, white. All of these are possibilities. So we're looking for some way that a molecule that when it arises could somehow get an advantage over other molecules. So we're now starting to think about, well, you could wait until this random chemistry generates you. And there's some probability that, well, the longer you are, the lower the probability that you'll be generated. But maybe it's much easier to make white white than a string of 5 or 10 whites, right? So the random chemistries are playing out. But we also allow for these rules of interaction where a string of, let's say, so opposites attract, that means if you're the same, you repel. And maybe in the case of a black, black, black versus another black, 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 these things are never going to come together. They're like magnets repelling each other. Whereas a black, 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 white, white, white want to come together. So now you can imagine if I randomly create these entities that maybe they could, as we suggested with 3 blacks and 3 whites, they could be coming together perfectly aligned. Or the sequences could be such that they get staggered when they come together. And if there's a staggering here, then whatever part is single-stranded rather than double-stranded could be saying, well, if I want to elongate the part that's not fully extended, then there's a bias. Because if the single-stranded part is black, black, then there's a bias to putting in 2 whites there. All right, so we're playing with simple rules. Ones that essentially randomly start to string together molecules, and then other ones that allow these things to not to fold up, but to interact with each other and interact in ways that are not perfectly aligned and give bias to sorts of chemistries that might elongate. So we might have some kind of biased chemistries. And that's the way, at least ways that I've been thinking about some of this. We've got ways that we can start to randomly create the black and white molecules strung together. And that clever chemists have devised systems to study how these linear molecules can be coming together to form these double molecule complexes and potentially serve as templates. So if you can serve as a template, then you can be biasing what longer molecules might be forming versus if you're a longer molecule that has to come about only through the rules of random stringing together. So there's a kind of bias to the chemistry that might be able to give an advantage to certain kinds of chemistries that are able to start to serve as templates. And so we're sneaking in little bits of biology. We know that this is the kind of principles that play out when DNA is being copied. So you have a one template, and one template essentially you can say is a template of one blacks and whites coding or ones and zeros. And if I have a 110, then 001 would be the corresponding string. So that's essentially when during development, when you're a fertilized egg, that fertilized egg is doubling and doubling again and doubling and eventually forming an embryo. That's making many copies of that original genome that the parents donated. And that's essentially saying for that it's a double-stranded template. One is 110 and the other one is 001. And both of them, when separated, can form as templates to propagate the information. So we're taking this idea and imagining how the building blocks, given this ability to template, could bias the chemistries. And so the current living systems are inspiring us to think about, well, what features can we distill out from current biology that might have been plausible for the very earliest kinds of molecules? And that,
So is there, sorry to jump in,
yeah,
is it fair to say that when your chemistry becomes such that it allows for stickiness,
yeah,
then suddenly your possibilities for complexity grow exponentially?
yeah. We're
So,
allowing for interactions that weren't there before.
right.
Yeah. And the
And
nature of the interactions means that a given template can say, if this template is present, then it can bias the chemistry for a longer template, a longer molecule. And essentially, that means that the A molecule could serve as a template for making B, right? And otherwise, if A is not around, B has a much lower probability of forming because
but now we're talking about all of a sudden this is allowing us to talk about reproduction.
yes, because A could serve as a template for B. That means B could serve as a template for C.
Right.
And if C can serve as a template for A, then you have this cooperativity. You've closed the loop. Everyone can gain by being part of this collective. You can call it a molecular cooperation. Hey, someone's around that's going to facilitate my synthesis. I'm going to facilitate someone else's synthesis. And if they facilitate the people, the entities that facilitated my synthesis, we've got a society or a group or a cooperation among the molecules based on these simple rules of interaction.
So is it possible that this process could the complexity or the stickiness of these molecules could propagate a very rapid transformation into the kind of complexity we would call life, that it wouldn't have to be an incredibly slow and plodding process. Once enough stickiness is there as a potential, we could have a blossoming of life.
Yeah, I think it's the nature. I guess I won't I won't qualify how fast it'll occur. But I think the way of building up the rules of interaction. What are the sorts of rules of interaction? I'm looking for the minimal rules of interaction. What are the simplest kinds of conditions I can imagine that could allow, let's say, this emergent kind of property, like molecular cooperation? And then you can think about, well, if A serves as a template for B, then could A serve as a template for B prime, a slightly different variant of B? And we know this from when we copy DNA, that it's not a perfect process, that there's some sloppiness to the process. And that's bad if you want to preserve the same information, but that's good if you want to generate genetic and functional diversity.
So that's evolution right there.
That's evolution. So I'm very interested in ways that we can do templating to preserve or begin to cooperate, but also sloppy templating. So we cooperate, but we also generate variation. And then then you can imagine rather than A, B, and C supporting each other, then there's also A, B prime, C prime supporting, and various variants of these that under different conditions, higher temperatures, more acidic, more salty, that some of these might have a little bit of an advantage over the others. So these cooperations that have different kinds of um, propensities to do better in one environment than another. And then the emergent sorts of different environments then start to give some rise to different kinds of chemistries. And eventually that plays out into, well, different parts of your body. Some are for processing, what you see and hear, and other parts are for pumping your blood. And so that's kind of the extreme case of kind of differentiating these sorts of functions. But early on, it might have just been, what are the simplest rules we can imagine? And how might we be able to start to see molecular cooperation emerge from something that's just random stringing together?
Okay, so we have a little bit of time left, and I'm glad you gave the example of maybe ones sticking to zeros and zeros sticking to ones, or ones sticking to ones and zeros to zeros. Because in the air right now is a great deal of talk about AI and development of AI. And I mean, every podcast I put on, they're talking about AI. Um, and so the fundamental question is, I think, will we create an AI that is alive? And I'm wondering if, with the kind of propositions you're giving us, if you can conceive of an AI that is alive. In other words, can it make copies of itself? It obviously has the required complexity. I mean, what is your thinking about this? Because it's obviously a thrill and a desperate fear at the
Yeah,
same time.
yeah. I'll back up and say rather than AI, let's talk about AL. It wasn't actually called AL, but the term was artificial life. And there have been books written about it, and there has been research done on it. And it's essentially people in the computer doing what we've talked about over the last hour or so. So people saying, okay, let's allow ones and zeros to string together randomly. And let's play with a variety of kinds of rules of how these strings might interact with each other. And let's also allow for a sloppiness in that process.
So this is in a model of thinking about building a computer structure.
No, it's using our standard computer programs to encode the sorts of rules that we've
Okay.
been talking about
Okay.
to essentially simulate the chemistries that we were talking about. Except now the strings are ones and zeros, and we allow them potentially to interact, to be error prone. So this is something that I would say maybe 1980s or so. So, 1980s, 1990s. If you look for books on artificial life, you'll find Santa Fe Institute was one of the early places where they do a lot of sorts of abstract thinking about, what is life? Could we create it? So, along with the people thinking about creating life in the test tube, doing the chemistries, there were people asking, well, what are the minimal rules to create something that's lifelike? And could it be evolvable? And from playing with these rules, one sees that, yeah, you can get cooperation arising. You can see simple rules playing out, and you can see molecules arising, molecular ecologies coming out of this sort of thing. And so very complex phenomena can arise from very simple rules, just allowing them to play out. So that's a small step in the direction of what you were, I think, referring to, which is maybe something that maybe it gets more towards consciousness or but it is and I don't think anyone from that uh as far as I know, none of that kind of work uh got into any questions of uh something approaching a mind. It was more, hey, molecular strings, we can play around with the minimal rules and we can see interesting things arise that seem to have parallels to life as we know it, at least at the, let's say, the microbial level or even ecological sorts of, you know, predator and prey. So you get a system that where the molecules can replicate themselves. You also find these smaller molecules that start to prey on them. And you think, hey, that's like a virus. It's essentially getting into the material and so I think it's very plausible that virus-like entities, although viruses we know need to have living cells to replicate themselves, I wouldn't be surprised in the precursors before we had any living cells, if we had replicating chemistries, they were almost certainly invaders. Uh, Molecular parasites that somehow found a way to do the same thing because at least the sorts of computational, let's play with the simplest rules, would always see these sorts of molecular parasites arise. spontaneously. Just, they arise and hey, they have a way to steal the resources from the established emergent self-replication.
So there could be a kind of an evolutionary process where this predator is created and either it thrives or it doesn't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And if I had to extrapolate, if I had to really imagine this going on in the way you asked about AI, I guess I would have to imagine that all the AI is currently focused, most of what we hear at least is software, right? You're doing everything at the software level. But you also hear about self-driving cars, self-driving laboratories. So if I had to imagine an AI evolving as I was trying to guess, your kind of a different kind of life, then maybe it's going to be a self-driving um, uh, entity that synthesizes its own computational hardware, and it might be a hardware that humans can't, understand, but the AI has created, maybe as a means to divert, try to create ones that humans won't be able to decode, that
Mm.
the AI itself is able. Maybe that's the basis of an interesting science fiction, or maybe it's already happening. I don't know. But the aspect of the coding, what we think of the AI as moving into hardware, and where the coded hardware is actually creating new languages and maybe evolving, where the co software coding evolves the hardware coding, I think could be something along the lines of AIs that we as humans may find very hard to comprehend.
Mhm. Final question. I know there's an ongoing search for life out in the universe. And if you watch science fiction, that life always takes the form of basically a human, but maybe with some antennas or a blobby skull. But that obviously is because of the needs of having human actors. Um, are there any pressures for life to be cellular or be in some ways recognizable to us? Or could life exist in forms that we're not even looking for because we haven't conceived of the possibility?
Yeah, I think, well, people talk at NASA about life as we don't know it, right? So, and one looks for maybe signatures of cooperation, not necessarily carried out by molecules that we know of. So there is that aspect of how should we think about life that isn't our own example. And I think that is then one begins to abstract, well, what is it actually about our life that seems to be um, maybe how we can imagine life, but not necessarily in the hardware that we are familiar with. And so that's a challenging area, and that's theory and experiments and people are thinking about these, and you can only get so much information, and you can increasingly get more information about what's going on in other galaxies through the powerful telescopes that can teach us about the chemistries happening in their atmospheres, in exoplanets. And there is a whole aspect of biosignatures. What are the sorts of signatures in the chemistries that might reflect something that we could attribute to life or emergent life?
Thank you so much for talking about these fascinating topics.
It's been a pleasure.